Joined by economist Owen Nkomo via video link. Owen, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us and a warm welcome to the late edition.
Thank you for having me, Simpiwe, and good evening to the viewers.
It's an absolute pleasure having you join us this evening, Owen. Now, first of all, for purposes of giving context to this discussion, we could perhaps start with the distinction between a mutual bank like Ithala and a fully fledged commercial bank in South Africa, and how the regulation of mutual banks differs from that of commercial banks, and why this distinction is especially important in the case of Ithala.
So the regulation of both types of banks, the mutual bank and the normal commercial bank, and any banking services or banking company in the country is actually regulated by the same Prudential Authority. But it must be noted as well that Ithala is not a mutual bank, but it's a state-owned enterprise in quotation marks, because in this case, the state is the provincial government of KwaZulu-Natal, and that is the government that actually owns this enterprise, this state-owned enterprise. But it's still subjected to the same banking rules and regulations that the other big banks are subjected to, with the only proviso and difference being that Ithala has been given leeway and some provision to operate like a fully fledged bank, even if it does not have a commercial bank. And the idea was that Ithala was going to apply for a fully fledged license in the past and become a fully commercial bank. But the regulation of the entity is still under the responsibility of the Prudential Authority of South Africa.
And such Prudential Authority argues that the court failed to consider the irreparable harm to depositors and the public interest. From your perspective, Owen, what might that harm entail?
Look, it's highly debatable, and I think that from the regulator's perspective, the concern is the safety of depositors' monies left with Ithala. If Ithala should have a proper rundown and just collapse all the way to zero, then you might have the deposits that were put in by their their share, or rather their clients, not actually being protected. But an argument can be put that if Ithala can actually maintain the security and safety of the depositors' monies, then it should be allowed to continue to operate. And I think that this is what should have been the case over the years, to try and make sure that depositors' money is actually protected in the case of Ithala. But I think this then remains to be determined in the legal courts this Friday, to see if that safety on behalf of clients of Ithala is actually still safeguarded. And this is what the Prudential Authority is trying to ascertain and argue that it is not the case. And the Judge Muzikawukhelwana there seems to hold a different view, and I do think it's going to be an interesting session on Friday.
And Owen, given what happened with the VBS Mutual Bank, do you think South Africa's current regulatory framework adequately protects depositors of mutual banks?
You know, mutual banks are different, obviously, to Ithala. Like I've said, mutual banks are owned by the shareholders and the depositors of that bank. They're actually the ones that call the shots. They put in capital and they take 100% risk in the event that something goes wrong. But with Ithala, the responsibility of the bank staying stable and being a going concern is the responsibility of the provincial government. And I do think that it is actually the provincial government that is going to make sure that Ithala is saved if the deposits made by the depositors are to be deemed safe. And I think this is why we're seeing the provincial government being actively involved in making sure that Ithala doesn't come to the same fate that VBS came to a few years ago.
Now, what systemic risks, if any, does Ithala's collapse pose to South Africa's financial system compared to commercial bank failing?
Absolutely very limited, especially if you take into consideration the fact that you're talking about 250,000 depositors being clients of Ithala Bank. Our newest bank in the country, being Time Bank, already has north of 4 million clients. So Ithala's risk to the broader system is very limited, but it continues to be a historic pride of the KZN province. And I do think that it's important to note that it's actually one of those sad cases where you have a bank which was started in the 70s which was overtaken by other banks such as Capitec and the newer banks that were spoken about, like Time Bank. Mismanagement of the bank and its balance sheet and the lending policies there that could have been handled differently meant that Ithala does not become a giant that it potentially could have been. And one thing that just like the Americans did during the financial crisis, maybe Ithala needs to consider creating two structures where they have a bad bank and a good bank. The bad bank being the bank where they put all the negatively valued assets and giving that time to run with the support of the balance sheet of the province. And the good bank running commercially, being viable, making sure that depositors' cash and deposits are safe. And I think that the same scenario that played out with African Bank needs to play out, but it needs to play out at provincial level. Ithala, certainly in my humble view, could be rescued if a structure like that can be put in place.
And having said that, Owen, if the pending provisional liquidation, for argument's sake, is granted, what then happens to Ithala's 250,000 depositors and their funds, practically and legally?
So it would then be curtains. I mean, it would be sad to see that happen. We cannot have another Blacks founded bank following the same pathway that VBS followed. One would hope it doesn't get there. But if it does, then the depositors are most likely going to get a portion of what they deposited in the bank when they actually open their accounts. And that will be worked out, obviously, by the people that will be responsible for the liquidation process. But one thinks and hopes that this time things might work out differently. And Friday is a very big day. We cannot continue to have Black institutions in the financial services space, being mismanaged to their end, because we are just essentially working against, the policies of PE that we set up that were meant to actually make sure that more entities are in Black hands and have got Black clients. And I think that it's going to be a very interesting reading to see on Friday. But hopefully things don't work out worst for the depositors in Ithala Bank.
Well, certainly Friday is a big day indeed, because we had to see whether the Prudential Authority might prefer liquidation over continued operations under the current conditions. But Owen, great chatting to you, man. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, as we've heard, Ithala Bank has historically played a developmental banking role in KwaZulu-Natal, and its collapse could certainly, and significantly prejudice small businesses, rural development, and financial inclusion in the province. We have so many questions. I mean, whether the government should step in to save Ithala Bank, given its developmental mandate, or would that set a dangerous precedent for banking discipline in South Africa? Time will tell. We just spoke to economist Owen Nkomo.